Hello, my name is Len Bear, also known as P. Sardonicus on Twitter. And today is July 27th, 2022, and this is Conversations with Experts. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Robert Bartholomew, who is currently in New Zealand, where he's an honorary senior lecturer at the Department of Physiological Medicine at the University of Auckland. How are you doing, Doctor?
Good. Look, thank you very much for inviting me on. And I just think, there's so much polarization out there in terms of the United States these days and in the world as well. And look, I'm skeptical of Havana Syndrome. You appear to believe that it's real. And why can't two seemingly intelligent, nice people have a friendly conversation about this? And I heard a previous talk by yourself online, and you certainly come across as an honest, sincere person. I think you're mentally stable. You look very normal and healthy. And yeah, so I said, you invited me on the program, and I said I'd be more than happy to have a conversation.
That's all we're gonna have. We're gonna have a civil, scientific conversation, and I really appreciate this introduction. So that was very kind of you. Um, can I call you Robert?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Okay, and you can call me.
I should say at the beginning, it's taken me like a year to grow this. To have a beard like yourself would probably take my entire lifetime. I'm not very prolific at growing facial hair, but anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. There's a story behind the beard too, but
Okay.
maybe next time.
Yeah, sure.
My first question, which I ask all my guests, because they're experts in something. So Robert, what are you an expert in, and how did you arrive to this place in your life?
Well, I did a PhD about 35 years. Well, I've been studying mass psychogenic illness for about 35 years, did a PhD on that topic in the late 90s. The chairman of my PhD committee was Arthur Kleinman, the former head of social medicine at Harvard. I did that degree at James Cook University in Australia. And I've been interested in mass psychogenic illness and social panics, also pseudoscience. I've written books on haunted houses, Bigfoot, lake monsters, UFOs. And on all of those subjects, I am a sympathetic skeptic. I don't believe. And I tell people it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. So you have to look at the evidence. I want to believe. Are there UFOs? Of course there are UFOs. There are objects in the sky people can't identify. It doesn't mean it's an extraterrestrial spacecraft, right? And so for me, I need to see the dead body of the Bigfoot in front of me. I need to see the dead space alien or the dead chupacabra there. And so that was an area of my interest many years ago. I've done a few books on that subject, but more recently I've gotten into things like the issue with Havana Syndrome. And so that's where my interest has been.
Very good. I'm very much on the same page as far as believing. Believing is sort of a subjective wish, but evidence overrides beliefs, and we are all about evidence. We're all about scientific method, and I'm very much with you. So of course, so you mentioned Havana Syndrome, and I know that you and Robert, is it Bello?
Yep.
Robert Bello, you published a book in March of 2019 titled Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. Very good title. very prerogative. I mean, it just wanted me to grab that book and read it, um, and it lives up to the title. So my question about it, do you, because in your later articles, you simply call it a psychogenic illness, Havana Syndrome, you consider it a psychogenic illness. So do you distinguish between a psychogenic illness as a result of mass hysteria and a psychogenic illness without that background?
Yep. Can I just clarify quickly? Our book came out in May of 2020.
Oh,
And
2020.
yeah, and so mass psychogenic illness. What's your question again?
So the question is, you call Havana Syndrome a psychogenic illness, but you also
Yeah.
have ACE for mass hysteria. So do you distinguish between a psychogenic illness as a result of mass hysteria and a psychogenic illness without that portion?
Yeah. Look, I wasn't happy with the book title. I certainly wouldn't have titled the book the way they did. However, when you look at what's happened there, I think the vast majority of cases of so-called Havana syndrome don't involve mass psychogenic illness. I think a lot of these cases are people who have been told to be on the alert for a sonic or microwave attack, and they wake up in the morning or in the middle of the night and they have an array of symptoms, and they redefine a variety of symptoms that they're having under this new label, Havana syndrome. And I think they would have had those symptoms anyway. But they might be an intelligence officer or a diplomat, and they've been told to be vigilant for, initially it was a sound, right? A sonic attack. That was the first thing that was claimed. So
let's not let sonic attack, because that implies that we know the causality. Sonic would mean that they were attacked with ultrasound. We are not really sure what happened, what caused it. So let's leave that.
But here's the thing. When it first started, the State Department doctors came to the conclusion that it was most likely a sonic weapon using sound waves, because people were hearing sounds that were associated with their symptoms. So the initial theory was from the State Department that these people were victims of a sonic weapon. And then later in around 2018, I think it was first proposed by Beatrice Golub at the University of San Diego, suggested that this was some type of microwave attack, right? And now you see things like people will say energy attack, whatever that means, right? And so it's kind of evolved over time. But at the early stages, the top brass at the American Embassy in Havana told the intelligence officers and the diplomats there, and this was shared with the Canadians as well, that they suspected they might be the victims of a sonic weapon and to be on alert for any unusual sounds. And so people were hearing sounds and then feeling unwell, or they were feeling unwell and then hearing sounds, right? And that's a classic setup for a mass psychogenic illness. And of course, of the first 21 patients who were looked at, 8 of them recorded those attacks. And it was later analyzed by that classified group, the so-called Jason group, which was declassified their study in September of 2021. And they concluded that what those 8 people had recorded were the mating calls of the Indy short-tailed cricket in Havana. So that led me to a belief that these so-called victims were actually experiencing some type of psychosomatic reaction and not actually an attack.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you a question. Do you know who first examined this Havana, which US-based physician was first to examine these patients?
My understanding is that would have been Michael Hoffer at University of Miami.
Correct. I
And
use.
yep.
Sorry. Yeah, that is.
It's so important to understand the context here, and that is in late November of 2016, you had several undercover CIA officers who were living in posh homes in this neighborhood of Havana. And they were walking outside their homes at night, and they noticed these unusual sounds. And one of them said, it's almost like someone's pointing a beam of sound at my home. And they didn't think too much of it, but they were aware of it. And then at the very end of December of 2016, one of them went to the American Embassy clinic, and he said, I've got headache, I've got difficulty hearing and ear pain, and these are fairly common symptoms in doctors' offices, every day. But he said, I'm concerned that this may be the result of these sounds I'm hearing. It's like someone's pointing a beam of sound at my home. And the doctor didn't think too much of it, but then a couple of other CIA officers from his same unit mentioned the same thing. And then this folk theory emerged that perhaps they were being targeted by the Cubans, perhaps in coordination with the Russians, because the technology in Cuba isn't that advanced, and that they might be the victims of some type of new secret device that was targeting them as a form of harassment, because there's a long history of Cuban agents harassing Americans in Cuba going into the past, prior to Obama opening up the embassy in 2015. And the diplomats who went to Cuba in 2015 were told about that. They said, you will be surveilled 24/7. And there is this long history. Like, people would wake up in the morning in their homes, and they'd walk downstairs and there'd be cigarette butts on their kitchen table, and they didn't smoke. There'd be dog poo on their kitchen floor, and they didn't have a pet. They'd go out and they'd park their car somewhere, and someone would park within like an inch of them, and they can't get out, right? Fairly low level harassment. And so this was well known to the diplomats going over there into Cuba. And so you've got this unique backdrop, which once this emerged, they were hearing these sounds, it was natural for them to think, oh, well, maybe we're being harassed by some new type of secret weapon, whether it's sonic, whether it's microwave, which that theory came later, or energy weapon. So that developed. And then the diplomats at the American embassy were told, don't stand or sleep near windows. So now they're really on alert. And they were told to be on alert for hearing sounds. And then they were hearing sounds and feeling unwell. And for me, that's a classic setup of mass psychogenic illness. And then simply redefining an array of symptoms that people have in their lives every day within a new frame. And then you've got something separate. You've got what happened in Cuba. Then you've got it spread around the world. Now, how did it spread around the world? Well, in 2017 and then into 2018, you had the reports at the Chinese American Embassy personnel in China and different parts of China reporting symptoms of Havana Syndrome. And at that point, the American State Department alerted all of their diplomats and intelligence officers around the world to be alert for the various symptoms of so-called Havana Syndrome. And then in September of 2021, the Department of Defense issued a similar alert to all 2.9 million military personnel and contractors around the world to be hyper vigilant and to do your patriotic duty and report any symptoms of Havana Syndrome. But the problem there is the symptoms of Havana Syndrome were headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, disorientation, confusion, tinnitus, insomnia, balance problems, spatial awareness issues, ear pain, and claims of brain damage, hearing loss, depression, nosebleeds. I mean, what isn't Havana syndrome? And that's a problem because there's so many symptoms. And if you tell people to try to remember over the last 6 years what's happened in their life and have you experienced anything like this, you can easily get people going back, well, 3 years ago I experienced something unusual, and then you start, redefining things, and it's a recipe for confusion.
Point well taken. Could we go back to Dr. Hoffer, and could
Yep.
you tell me what was your impression of he was the first US-based physician to examine these 25 symptomatic individuals and 10 asymptomatic individuals who resided in the same apartments. And he found objective findings, objective tests. He conducted objective vestibular tests that are impossible to fake. And he found otolithic injury in all these 25 symptomatic patients. Are you familiar with these results?
Oh, yeah. Yep. And have you seen our book?
I have not read the book in its entirety. What I have read is your publication in a British journal. It's a commentary called Challenging the Diagnosis of Havana Syndrome as a Novel Entity. And this is
Sure.
This is where I got this is what really surprised me, because you call Dr. Hoffer's findings ambiguous, inconclusive, and even meaningless. And that really gave me a pause.
Yep.
But do you stay by this statement?
Absolutely. And look, if you look, when the editors at JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, got the first study for Havana syndrome, which was in 2018. And Dr. Hoffer was initially on that study, and I believe he took his name off the study because they didn't show him all of the data, so he took his name off the study. When that study came out in January of 2018, the editors at JAMA, before that study was published, went to Bob Ballo, my co-author of the book, at the UCLA Medical Center, because Bob Ballo is the authority on the vestibular system. He's written the standard textbook in the field. So they wanted to get his opinion of what they thought of that first JAMA study. And Bob Ballo looked at the study, he reviewed it, and he rejected it. And they published it anyway. And that's when he contacted me. And we ended up doing the book together. And there's a lot of anomalies, very unusual things going on here. For example, Bob said, and Bob's nearly 80 now, and he said, in the course of my life as a neurologist, that he has reviewed about 1,000 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He said, in every single instance, they always give you the reviews of the other people who are reviewing, the examiners. Not in this case. They didn't show him anybody else who had examined the article. So there's some very unusual stuff that's not the scientific process. That's not the way this should be done. Michael Hoffer, that study was looked at by Bob Ballo, and he said on the vestibular testing of the balance and eye movement, that they reported an array of ambiguous anomalies that without an appropriate control group, because they didn't have an appropriate control group, it's impossible to interpret and it's essentially meaningless. And since then, there's been a lot of criticism of the Hoffer study and of the two JAMA studies and of the pesticide study done by the Canadians, who I met when I went over to Cuba for the conference on Havana Syndrome. There are an array of issues with Michael Hoffer's study. Do I think he's a quack? I don't think he's a quack. But it's not mainstream science either. And there are serious concerns. And look, if I could ask you, so you've had symptoms, and then so you've consulted a neurologist or consulted Michael Hoffer, and so you've been examined by him, is that right?
That is correct. I'd rather not talk about my case because this is not the purpose of our conversation. I would like to, I would absolutely entertain your questions at a different time, but I'd like to concentrate on Dr. Hoffer's findings in the symptomatic Havana Syndrome patients.
Okay, so look, let me just say this then. Here's my quibble with a lot of what's been going on. First of all, you got the National Academy of Sciences study going out, right? Their panel. And they interviewed Dr. Hoffer. Why didn't they interview Bob Ballo? Why didn't they interview myself? Sergio Della Sella at the University of Edinburgh. If you look at the Hoffer study, there was no ear damage demonstrated. There was no hearing loss demonstrated. It got reported in the media for months and months before that study came out that about a third of the patients, this had been leaked to the media, had hearing loss. But when they actually gave them the standard hearing test, there was no hearing loss. There were 2 patients who showed hearing loss, but they had pre-existing hearing loss before they went to Cuba. So, but that's out there in the media and in these news reports. There was hearing loss in that study. Not true. When the study came out, that was clear. They had no appropriate controls in the study. There were 10 housemates who did not report symptoms, and they were not tested. I don't know why they would not have tested them. Prior to the study, it was claimed that a third of the patients had the hearing loss, and when it came out, that was different. And so there are all these issues with the study. There were an array of symptoms suggestive of different causes, aside from dizziness, which is very common and notoriously difficult to measure. There was little overlap with the symptoms. So there's all kinds of issues with this study. And with the other studies that have been done as well. You know, the claims of brain damage, the claims of vestibular damage, they were not demonstrated. Bob Ballo is the expert on the vestibular system, and he is adamant that is not the case.
But that's not what Dr. Hoffer reported. I'd like to quote him. Actually, this is not, first of all, the hearing loss was not reported by Dr. Hoffer. You're talking about the media. And so media doesn't.
Well, that was leaked by people in that study to the media. And that was in the press for months and months. Yep, go ahead.
We're not going to discuss media because that's a little overwhelming, and we're going to talk about science. So I would like to specifically quote Dr. Hoffer. This is from his lecture when he presented results of his publication. There has been criticism that some of these tests, and he's referring to vestibular tests. Some of these tests, some of the people with anxiety or people with other disorders have these abnormalities, but not to this degree. Do you have any comment?
Well, my comment is it's a poorly done study. I mean, there's no controls. There's all kinds of issues with this, and Bob Ballo has addressed these. And so, what can you say other than it's a poorly done study? As were the two JAMA studies. The two JAMA studies were poorly done. The pesticide study with the Canadians was poorly done as well. So there's no real clear evidence. And what I found interesting was that, you got all this ambiguous diagnostic criteria. What I found interesting was your description of, like, you've had symptoms and these symptoms continue. And so I'm wondering if you can describe the symptoms that you have for the audience, so we can know what symptoms you're experiencing, and because you were saying that you're having these almost on a daily basis, and so do you think that somebody's targeting you on a daily basis? I guess that would be my observation.
I take the fifth on that. We're not talking about my case. Thank you for the question, Robert. I'd like to read another quote by Dr. Hoffer.
Yep.
From the same lecture. Most importantly, this is a real physical injury in those truly affected. The 25 individuals that we saw had objective findings of a disorder that came acutely from what happened in Cuba. I am talking about people who came to Miami. They didn't know what they were supposed to say and had objective findings. You can't fake a VEMP test. That's one of the vestibular tests, the evoke myogenic potential. You can't fake subjective visual vertical. You can fake it, but it would be apparent to us that you're faking it. So the tests were real and they were objective. And that's important because the 25 most affected individuals are often accused of malingering or exaggerating. I can tell you that, those 25 are not. I would like specifically address the comment that you made before I get your comment on this. These tests are widely used by, dizziness doctors, otoneurologists, and so we know what the normal responses are in the population. So not having the control, it's simply because these were patients. They came to Dr. Hoffer privately. And so these are limitations, and I understand the limit. We all want a perfect protocol that has control, that has everything right, and everything is perfect, but life is not perfect. So when he found these objective vestibular abnormalities, and he's saying, these are not abnormalities that you see in a general population. These are not abnormalities that you even see in some functional disorders. You see these abnormalities when the autolytic organs are actually injured. And that's an important point. So to say that these results are meaningless, that you have a patient and you find the objective test that nobody can fake at the level of injury, that's not meaningless. That is an objective finding. And
okay.
I don't think anybody has challenged Dr. Hoffer on that. The levels of ortholytic injury are beyond functional abnormalities. They're at the level of physical.
Okay.
Right.
Well, Bob Ballo, people like Sergio Della Sella at University of Edinburgh would challenge that, and they have a different interpretation of that. Let me make another point, and one of the points Dr. Hoffer has made is that, this couldn't be faked because some of these patients didn't know the other patients were ill. Is that not true? Is that correct? Dr. Hoffer has stated that there were some patients at the embassy who didn't know that the other people were reporting symptoms, correct? And so as a result, how could they know? How could this be some type of psychogenic thing if they didn't even, if there was no awareness that other people were getting sick, correct?
I just read you the exact quote, so I'm not gonna, Dr. Hoffer can speak for himself, but these are
Well, no, let me tell you what Dr. Hoffer has said. Dr. Hoffer has said that these patients in Cuba couldn't have, some of these patients didn't know what the other patients were experiencing. They had no idea what was going on. I can tell you we said that. And so we had people from the American Embassy contacting us upset about that, who said that everybody knew that it spread like wildfire. And we know through the some of the documents that were examined through people like Tim Golden, who was a journalist over there, that the spread happened from the CIA officers to the American Embassy and then to the Canadian Embassy. So the people that we've talked to have said everybody knew it was a poorly kept secret. It's not like these symptoms were spreading and nobody knew what was going on. And that's an important point to make.
Okay.
And so Dr. Hoffer is wrong on that account. I mean,
okay.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, you did your own research. I'm just simply quoting Dr. Hoffer.
Yep.
But I do disagree with you on the fact that these abnormalities at this level are simply functional or variation on the norm. They're far beyond the norm. They're at the level of physical injury. That has been made very clear to me personally, and from his lectures and from his publications. And I'd like to see that criticism that it doesn't represent, that these tests do not represent physical injury to the elderly.
There are a lot of people who would dispute Dr. Hoffer's findings, Bob Ballo and a number of other people, and who have, and we've done that in our book. So I dispute the claims there of Dr. Hoffer. And my suggestion to you, and I mean this sincerely, I would get another opinion from another neurologist or another group. I think as a doctor, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And because you have a personal, which is private, which you discussed in a previous cast there that I saw. So you have these symptoms that are occurring. I would get another opinion from another a specialist neurologist. That would be my advice to you, because Dr. Hoffer, you can say that this is what Dr. Hoffer is saying, but I can tell you that there are other very credible experts who are specialists in the vestibular system who completely disagree with what Dr. Hoffer is saying. And we can go back and forth for an hour here, but that's a fact as well, that they disagree with those findings. We've elaborated on that in our book. Bob Ballo's elaborated on it, and there are other neurologists as well who disagree. People, a number of them.
Well, definitely not in your commentary, because you to me, and this is my impression, that you've been dismissive of Dr. Hoffer's finding. I would like to see another expert who would challenge Dr. Hoffer's findings. And please don't refer me to a book.
Can I make here's a suggestion. My suggestion would be to interview Bob Ballo, who is the expert on the vestibular system, and he can address very specifically that aspect of the Michael Hoffer case. He's with the UCLA Medical Center, and I have his email address. I'll give you his email address if you'd like to interview Bob Ballo.
Okay, that would be absolutely great. I appreciate that, Robert.
And look, I realize that this can be an emotive issue, particularly because you perceive that you're affected by Havana Syndrome. And so because of that, I applaud you for having a calm conversation with me. I get fairly excited sometimes, but we're having a calm, rational conversation back and forth here. And, you're looking for answers. You're a sincere, genuine person who wants to find out what's happened to you or what's happening to you. And so I'm very sympathetic. I get frustrated sometimes because I see people in the news. There was that person who was over in Russia in 2017, Mark. His last name begins with P. It's a long name, right? You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
And so he's himself and other people were quite upset in September of 2021 when Pamela Spratlin, the head of the Biden panel on Havana Syndrome, had a Zoom call, kind of like what we're doing right now with a number of Havana Syndrome patients. And one of them asked, oh, recently there was some information leaked about the FBI study, which hasn't been publicly released, but some information was released to the press that the FBI had somehow concluded it was mass psychogenic illness. You don't believe that, do you? And Pamela Spratlin said, reportedly, well, I want to keep all options open. And after she said that, within days, she was forced to resign. Some of these patients, and I know Mr. Agent who was involved as well, were saying things like, we're not mentally ill, we're not crazy, we don't have a mental disorder. And they were quite upset by that. I would just say that mass psychogenic illness can happen to anybody. It is a collective stress response that's based on a belief. We all have beliefs. Therefore, we are all potential victims. I was on Al Jazeera and the announcer was grilling me saying, this can't happen to CIA officers and diplomats. These are intelligent people. These are well-educated, trained people. No, everybody is a potential victim because we all have beliefs and no one is immune from something like this. So I have never said, just for the record, that any of these people, I am sympathetic because the symptoms are as real as any condition. And I'm sympathetic to their suffering because they are suffering and they do deserve answers. And I will surprise you by saying something, and it's this. I do think that the diplomats in Cuba, the American diplomats who reported these symptoms, do deserve compensation. I think they deserve compensation from the American government because the American government has botched this investigation from the beginning. You had the Jason report of elite specialist scientists who in around 2018 came out with their study, which was classified, which they said that pulse microwave radiation was extremely unlikely. You had the FBI report, which came out in around 2018, which has been kept secret to this day, although the leaked information suggests that they concluded it was mass psychogenic illness, and it was not pulse microwave radiation. You had the CDC report, which said, well, basically, we're not sure. Then you had in December of 2020, the National Academy of Sciences report, which said, we're really not sure, but our best guess is pulse microwave radiation and so-called Frey effect. But the interesting thing about the National Academy of Sciences study, and you may not be aware of this, the National Academy of Sciences study, a lot of that study was done under COVID, and they just did public sourcing. They didn't have a lot of access to top secret government documents, not a massive access to it, according to David Relman in the talk that he gave that I was listening to. And so the National Academy of Sciences said that mass psychogenic illness is a legitimate possibility, but the problem here is There is zero data on the early epidemiological spread, none whatsoever. That came out in December of 2020, their report. In May of 2020, our book came out and we described the early epidemiological spread. They had cited myself and Bob Ballo several times in that report. And they cited different studies, including that one that you just mentioned, that was in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. But here's the interesting thing. They totally ignored our book and the epidemiological spread. So my question for David Relman, if you ever interview him, is how come he looked at our other stuff, but he ignored the book, which was the only book by legitimate scientists written on the subject. It was out well over half a year before their panel reached their findings. How come that was ignored? And here's the other thing I'll mention. You may not be aware of this. So in January of 2022, this year, the CIA came out, the main CIA, and they said that there'd been over 1,000 reports at that point. And there are only a small number that were unexplainable. And that the vast majority of cases were either anxiety or a number of ailments that are already out there, pre-existing conditions that have been redefined under a new label. And when that report came out, they came to the conclusion, well, they said there was no evidence of a foreign actor involved in these reports. And then a few days later, a small advisory panel to the main CIA issued another report. And their report was that it was most likely pulsed microwave radiation. And those are the only two reports that have come out and concluded it was the Frey effect, pulsed microwave radiation. The other ones, like the CDC, were either inconclusive or considered pulsed microwave radiation extremely unlikely. The FBI report, the so-called Jason report, which was updated in November of 2021, came to the same conclusion. But if you look at those two reports that came to the conclusion of pulsed microwave radiation, they have something in common. And that is David Relman was the head of both of those panels. David Relman is an exceptional microbiologist. However, when it comes to things like the vestibular system and vestibular, he comes out and he says there was definitely vestibular system damage. Not according to Bob Ballo, who is the specialist in the vestibular system, who JAMA went to first when they wanted to review that study. And so you've got these studies coming out, and here's what I wonder. There's politics mixed up here with the science, isn't there? Because you've got the FBI report, which has still not been released. Why doesn't the government release that report? And so what I'd like to see, and I think it's what you'd like to see as well, and that is release all this stuff. Release the Freedom of Information Act documents. They haven't released them. And let us see what's going on behind the scenes here. And let us examine the evidence for ourselves. Sorry for all that talking there without you letting get a word in there.
Point. I'm all for transparency because it is, to me, it is a public safety issue, because it is, just like you said, it's happening to me. I'm a civilian. I'm a member of the general public. It can happen to anyone. This is a public safety issue. But what I picked up on in your monologue on is that you do recognize that there are 24 of cases that could not be explained by previous disease, environmental factors. Coincidentally, this is the number of patients that Dr. Hoffer examined and diagnosed. What do you make of that?
Well, it reminds me of UFOs, and that is, the U.S. government has done different studies on UFOs, and their conclusions were skeptical. However, And in some of the studies they've done, they'll say, oh, we looked at X number of reports, and there are a small number of cases that are unidentified, that there's not sufficient data at this point. And that's basically what the CIA said, that there's not enough information with which to form an accurate assessment at this point. So they're holding open that possibility. And I think that's a fair assessment on your part, is to raise that. Just because there are a small number of UFO reports that people can identify doesn't mean that we're being visited by space aliens. And the same here. They need to gather more information about these reports. And like you, I'm all for transparency and all for finding more information about these cases. And my understanding is the main CIA, not the small advisory panel, but the main CIA is doing that right now as we speak. And they're going to report on this again in the near future. And I think I'm very interested to see what they find.
I'm looking forward to it as well. I have a question for you, Robert. So you're talking about people having beliefs and it affects their judgment and behavior and complaints, etc. The mass hysteria psychogenic hypothesis that you proposed, is that a belief? Is it a hypothesis, or is it something else?
Well, it's based on looking at what happened and also those JAMA studies, right? I mean, the 2019 JAMA study found brain anomalies. There's no question they found brain anomalies. And that got reported in the media as brain damage, but brain anomalies aren't brain damage. And it's not unusual in small cohorts like that to have anomalies such as this. And so that's unfortunate. And you've got 12 people who were in the patients who were examined who had a history of concussion compared to 0 in the control group. So there's all kinds of issues there in terms of the way these studies have been done. And the other issue is you've got people coming out and saying, who are involved in the JAMA study, saying, oh, it can't be mass psychogenic illness because there's no evidence that the patients were colluding together and feigning their symptoms together. Well, that's just not mass psychogenic illness. Mass psychogenic illness isn't collusion. And so that's unfortunate. But the other point I want to make is, and I made it before, and people will say to me, well, all these people were suffering from mass hysteria. I don't think so. You've got a lot of the people who are suffering from Havana Syndrome or this condition, I think are simply, they're not suffering from mass psychogenic illness. They're experiencing symptoms, and they were going to experience them anyway. And now they've been redefined under a new label, this thing, Havana Syndrome, like that 60 Minutes report, right? That came out. Did you see the 60 Minutes report about the so-called attacks at the White House? I mean, that's concerning. These people, and this woman was saying she was walking down these steps and she worked at the White House and she was getting dizzy and had difficulty with her spatial awareness and stuff like that, which sounds like a vestibular system issue. So when they were going through that, they talked to one of the embassy staff who was in China, and he and his family, he was convinced they had been attacked. And when they came back over to the United States, they were staying at a hotel in Philadelphia, and they were being examined by the doctors, I believe, at the University of Pennsylvania. And he said that, in the middle of the night, he got up and he saw his children thrashing around in bed. There was something called night tremors or night terrors that could potentially account for that. But okay, the thrashing around in bed. And he reaches down and picks up one of his 2 children. And as he does, he hears this swishing sound like water running. And then he reaches down to grab the other child and to comfort the child. And he hears the same sound. And the implication was in that 60 Minutes report that might have been some type of microwave or energy weapon that had been, targeting those individuals. And I've got no problem with 60 Minutes talking about this and coming up with this as a possible explanation. But there's a much more likely explanation there, and that is tinnitus. That's a common symptom of tinnitus. There's an expert on tinnitus who wrote an article that's titled, "Is that the water running or is that tinnitus?" And so to me, it was deception by omission. That if you want to give one side, that's fine, and they did, but they should have also mentioned that, the swishing sound is also a common symptom of tinnitus. And they left that out. And as a result, they made it much more dramatic. And I think that doesn't help anybody to try to get to the truth. I mean, I want both sides. And look, you're giving the other side here. You're giving Dr. Hoffer's side, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you just gave one side, which you're not, but that's what 60 Minutes did. And it really is frustrating because I grew up with 60 Minutes. I always had a lot of respect for them. I don't anymore. The news media has really, I think, let us all down on this issue.
Okay, but you didn't really answer my question. Is this a hypothesis, or is this some kind of conclusive statement that you have that this is a case of mass hysteria and psychogenic illness?
Well, of course, it's a hypothesis. And look, it's a classic setup for mass psychogenic illness, because for mass psychogenic illness, the key part is understanding the backdrop, the context, how this began. That's very important. And so you go back, and you have to go back to patient zero. And Tim Golden, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who interviewed a number of these people who were involved early on, he claims to have identified patient zero and then followed the spread from there in his ProPublica articles. I'm not sure if you've seen those articles. And surprisingly, the National Academy of Sciences ignored those two articles that he had published with Sebastian Rotella. And he's a top-notch journalist, looked at documents from the embassy, interviewed, I think, 36 people over there. And just to ignore that and to dismiss that, to me, is concerning. But this is a classic setup for mass psychogenic illness. And so when I look for the actual evidence of an attack, I don't see it either. I don't see the evidence of an attack from the two JAMA studies, from the Hoffer study, from the pesticide study from the Canadians as well. And so that's, and look, if these studies were so clear, why did the FBI come out and conclude that their explanation was mass psychogenic illness, or the Jason report, or the main FBI report? But you've got politics mixing with science here, and that's not good for any of us here, because you come across to me as somebody, you want to know the truth, I want to know the truth, and I think we're sincere, we're coming about it the right way, we're trying to be transparent, we're trying to have adult discussions about this, we're not swearing at each other or calling each other idiots or anything like that. And unfortunately, there's too much of that out there. And so, yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what the main FBI study comes up with, because they said they're going to come out with their findings shortly.
I think that we're mixing a lot of things together in this conversation. There's politics, there's intelligence report, and then there's a clinical science. I would prefer for us not to discuss whether they were attacks or not, but were these patients, the question is, and I specifically asked you about whether mass psychogenic illness is a hypothesis, because the way to prove a hypothesis is if you can't find a way to falsify it. To me, Dr. Hoffer's study falsifies it because it finds objective, verifiable tests that show brain injury. If we just su- sus- uh, if we just accept that statement as a valid statement for a second, do you think that would falsify your hypothesis?
Sure, but it's not there. I mean, the experts disagree with Michael Hoffer, and that's
I
why you really need to talk to somebody like Bob Ballo at UCLA.
I haven't seen it in the literature.
What's that?
I haven't seen that um, response to Dr. Hoffer's study that somebody would say, no, these tests do not reach the level of physical injury. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, talk to Bob Ballo, and yeah, I can give him his your email address, and or I can give you his email address, and you can contact him and go through that. I have to say, from the standpoint of mass psychogenic illness, this is a classic setup, with the nocebo effect. We've heard of the placebo effect,
Yeah.
and you got the nocebo effect, the evil twin, right? And I mean, there was a case a while back where you had a subject who was on an experimental antidepressant medication because he'd suffered from depression previously, and he'd had a fight with his girlfriend, and he took I think there were 29 caplets that were left in the bottle, and he took them all. And then he contacted his neighbor because he said, oh, I've had second thoughts. Maybe she wasn't worth it. I'm not sure. But anyway, he had second thoughts, and he was rushed to the hospital. He had dangerously low blood pressure, had an array of symptoms, was put on an IV for the next several hours, was monitored. The symptoms didn't abate. And then one of the people who was involved with the study came down to the hospital, and he said, oh, we checked. You were in the placebo group. And within about 15 minutes, his blood pressure started to return back to normal, and his symptoms dissipated. And it just goes to show the power of people to make yourself feel unwell with the nocebo effect.
But my point is, once again, we're not talking about symptoms. We're talking about objective findings, because that finding having objective findings that prove that show physical injury would falsify mass hysteria.
Yep.
Okay, we remember that. So why don't you think this position hasn't been published in the scientific literature? I mean, you have a book and you have the commentary, which really doesn't address these autolytic findings per se. You just find it, you criticize sort of the protocol, but you don't challenge the vestibular findings.
Bob Ballo has. Yep.
Okay.
So look, I would say interview Bob Ballo because he has spent his life as a specialist in the vestibular system, and he can go through it in greater detail. But we are very critical of Michael Hoffer's study in our book, very critical, in different sections of the book.
Okay, I think we actually have come to an agreement that if this was a brain injury, if the data showed that that the brain injury is objectively found, it would falsify your mass hysteria hypothesis.
But there is no, from my standpoint, there's no brain injury. No brain injury has been demonstrated. Of that, I am confident. And brain anomalies, yes. Brain injury, no. And there's a big difference between the two. And I blame the media for conflating them. The media hasn't been the friend of anybody here.
There's no media in this conversation. It's just us talking.
Yep.
We have an expert who testifies that these are levels of of autolytic injury. You have your co-author who hasn't really published his opinion in peer-reviewed literature. So I'm looking forward to speaking to him. But
have you seen the Jason study? Have you seen the Jason
yes,
report at all?
Yes.
Okay. So look, we are very critical of Michael Hoffer's study, and the claims that there is these injuries have occurred and there's brain damage as well. We dispute. We believe that it's poorly done. It's a poorly done study. And the two JAMA studies are poorly done, not demonstrated, the claims, and also the Canadian study as well. And so I think, it would, for somebody like yourself, who's involved with this and has a vested interest for sure, because you're directly involved, I would talk to Bob Ballo to directly address what he has studied for the last 50 years, the vestibular system, and what he would challenge with the Michael Hoffer study.
Looking forward to that conversation.
Yep.
Do you have any other comments or questions, except for my personal case, because this is not a subject of today?
Well, yeah, but the reason I had brought that up is because you were freely talking about it in another interview, and I thought you might have wanted to talk about that. That's all.
No.
Yeah, okay. That's fine, and that's your own personal issue. But I think, because you had mentioned that you believe that you're being attacked on a regular basis, I think it's much more plausible to think that you are experiencing some type of neurological condition and not the subject of some type of mysterious energy weapon or whatever it is out there that's or exposure to some type of energy or specific targeting. I think that's much more plausible. And my big saying is, when you hear the sound of hoofbeats in the night, first think horses, not zebras. And I would argue that at the State Department, the doctors went for the most exotic hypothesis early on. They went for sonic weapon. And when I mentioned sonic attack initially, you were like, well, let's not put a name to it. But that's what the people at the State Department did initially. They put a name to it. They put a name of a sonic attack, and then that got thrown out there, and then that was kind of put down because a sonic weapon, 99% of the sound waves are going to bounce off the outer wall, for starters. The other thing that gets thrown around here is the American Embassy. To my knowledge, not a single attack has occurred at the American Embassy, right? It happened at one of two large hotels in Cuba, at an apartment complex, and in people's homes, and then since in other parts of the world, right? But there's not a single case that I'm aware of that was reported at the American Embassy in Havana. And so you got all this misinformation out there, which is unfortunate. The claims of white matter track changes and stuff like that, that was out there for months and months and months. And then when they actually published the study in, what was it, February of 2018, they had 3 patients had white matter track changes, 2 were mild, and 1 was moderate. Well, that's what you would expect from any group of that size. And white matter track changes are common in things like migraine, normal aging, right? All sorts of things like that. And so there's just a lot of misinformation out there. And that's unfortunate because it muddies the waters. And I'll leave you with this, because I know we've gone over time here, but I have a suspicion, could be wrong, but I have a suspicion, and that is there are people from the Trump administration and the Biden administration who have been embarrassed by this and the findings that are coming out now with the main CIA, who have a vested interest to muddy the waters and to just make things a bit muddled and unclear. And so we really need our intelligence agencies, the CIA and the FBI, and we need to listen to them. And their conclusions of the main CIA and the FBI right now are The most likely explanation is mass psychogenic illness and a redefining of an array of symptoms that people would have had anyway under a new label. And let's see what happens when they come out with their further findings, and keep an open mind. But the evidence just isn't there for an attack. And so I'm sympathetic to these victims. I'm sympathetic to you. And I hope you feel better in the near future. And, it's unfortunate. It really is.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Robert. And I think we had a very civil and interesting conversation. Everybody will enjoy.
Yep. Look, Len, thank you so much for inviting me here, because I get sick of watching, shows on TV and stuff like this where you've got two people who are honest, sincere people who want to know the truth. And then you get all this stuff, which is like a media creation. I keep saying the media, but I don't like the media, the way they've presented all this stuff. And I just think that, I understand what you're doing. You want to leave all that out, don't you? And you just want to have like a conversation one-on-one. And I think it'd be great. I hope Bob takes you up on your offer to come on here and have a chat with you and to discuss the Hoffer findings. And so, look, thank you for taking the time to listen to me and for having a civil conversation. And I sincerely hope that you feel better and your symptoms get better soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Take care from New Zealand. Bye-bye.
Bye. Something is stop.